Alright everyone, it's time to talk about the legacy media piece here. This is from the AP. I'm not going to bother archiving this. I can't imagine they'll take it down since this is the fashionable, hip talking point of the legacy media right now. The idea of Liz Cheney comparing herself to Abraham Lincoln, and they're extrapolating way beyond that. There are also already rumblings of what her plan or strategy might be for a 24 run. They're actually crazy enough to believe that Liz Cheney would pose a significant threat against Trump in the primary should she run. They actually believe this. Even absent literally any other candidate other than Trump and Liz Cheney, she would lose. Part of the states would close their primaries anyway, because Trump has the technical incumbency and because he happens to have overrun the state structure behind the elections in a half a dozen places. So he'd automatically shoot right out of the gate with 500 or 600 delegates to begin with. And then he would trounce her everywhere else other than a handful of blue states where Dems would take a ballot in an open primary. But we'll get past that. What's at point here is that Liz Cheney is comparing herself to Abraham Lincoln. Well, he lost elections too before he saved the nation. It's got to be the most hyperbolic, cringe bullshit ever, and it shows the flipping of the parties. What I boil this down to is that the GOP, in abandoning Lincoln and embracing Trump, has decided that instead of living in a land of nostalgia and whimsy for past victories, they've decided that they want new victories. And that's really what scares the deep state and the Democratic Party, because the people that are reforming the Republican Party at this point aren't part of their group. They're outsiders. At least many of them are. Some of them, quite genuinely, I believe that's the case. They are outsiders. They're not part of the same entrenched long-term political structure that has been rotting away for the last half century. That's what they're afraid of. The Republican Party up until Trump, to an extent, it starts going away with Ron Paul and the Tea Party movement. Really, that's the foreshock to MAGA, and MAGA is sort of a foreshock to Ultra MAGA at this point, or Nuclear MAGA at this level. What the GOP represented was looking back at the past and saying, we did a good job. I use the analogy, someone bows their head solemnly, takes a deep breath, smiles slightly and says, well, we had a good run. Look at all the wonderful things we did. To the point where you show up at the Republican convention and you expect them to start talking about something they did 100 years ago. Well, we freed the slaves. Well, we delivered tax reform in the 50s and stuff like that, because they weren't doing anything modern. What did Bush do, or Herbert Walker? All the other Republicans in modernity, the McCains, the Romneys, the Bushes, and so forth, the Cheneys for that matter. Resting on your laurels, talking about how we're the party of principles that are 100 or 200 years outdated. Well, not 200 for the 150, sorry. Republican Party didn't exist 200 years ago. We did great things, and we strive to emulate that, but those great things are locked in the 19th century. The kind of social and economic issues in the world present during the Lincoln administration or even the goddamn Eisenhower administration are no longer widely applicable to the current world. The GOP was out of touch, whimsical, filled with remembrance and whimsy and fancy about all of the things that they did in the past. Meanwhile, the Democrats are like, now we need change for change's sake. Just ram it all through. Who gives a fucking shit? Part of that is nostalgic too, because they have adopted socialism, which peaked in the U.S. at the dawn of the 20th century, literally 100 years ago. But they are forward thinking. I mean, the problem is you're going forward off a cliff, and the Republicans, if they have any balls, they will attempt to move in the other direction, saying, hey, you just because you're proceeding in one direction doesn't make it progress. Oh, you're going down this hill towards a lake of lava, and you keep moving forward towards it. Well, you're moving forward. How progressive of you. The problem is that pretty soon your legs are going to melt off and your skin will be bubbling and then you'll die. The GOP ignored this for a very long time. The last time you had a sort of take it by the reins reformist movement was Morning in America again with Ronald Reagan. The Democrats seized upon that basic premise in the last paradigm and made it theirs with Bill Clinton, by the way. When Herbert Walker managed to fuck everything up, Clinton took that basic message and said, well, I want what he wants, but more welfare reform and a few trade deals, which screwed us, by the way, NAFTA, etc. Building nukes for North Korea comes to mind. But it was the same basic message. That same basic premise held sway for, about 3 decades. Trump has overturned the paradigm now. Again, there were foreshocks to it. The GOP is no longer the party of nostalgia. What I wish is the Democrats would stop being a party of nostalgia for socialism and for the identity politics of the early 20th century, which basically is the doppelganger of what's happening now. It goes past slave debate. It goes into like early Jim Crow and shit like that, I suppose, would be applicable. A lot of it then was class struggle. The Democrats are still waging that 100-year-old nostalgic war on enemies that by and large no longer exist, to the point where they constantly make up boogeymen about evil racist armies of Nazis and Klansmen and stuff coming for you and trying to put you back in the kitchen or in the ground or something. And that's basically their main selling point. The Republicans have been crippled for decades now by going along and playing the same game as the underdog. You're trying to play checkers against the dude who invented checkers. You're not gonna go very far. Hey, I just decided that I'm gonna challenge the CEO of Parker Brothers to a game of Monopoly. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. By the way, I think there are 1,000 different variants of Monopoly now. Just get the original. Get something vintage. It's more fun. How dare the GOP live in the current year? We heard a lot about that back in the middle of the 2010s. You know, John Oliver and some of these other morons and stuff. Well, it's the current year, everybody. You've got to get past the past. You've got these outdated notions. Well, the GOP did. They successfully made that transition. Liz Cheney represents a consensus of reality that speaks to an economic and social climate that does not exist anymore. MAGA is a reaction to this. It is the lashing out of the working and middle class mainly against a Republican Party that did not seem to represent people. Again, the other day we have the greatest evidence of this yet. Liz Cheney was booted out in Wyoming by a goddamn legendary margin. She alienated the people of her state by doing exactly what the GOP has been doing now for a very long time, and Cornyn and Romney and others represent this too, Murkowski and Collins. They represent a party that effectively ignores the people despite constantly saying, we're the grand old party, government of the people, we're the working class political fixture in the country. The Democrats are the party of the rich. That's definitely become a prophecy fulfilled, but there are still all of these neocons within the party. And they have whimsical nostalgia for Abraham Lincoln, who's been dead in the ground for a very long time. Lincoln doesn't lead the country right now. Lincoln speaks to a consensus and a time period and issues that don't exist anymore. There's no slave debate right now. There's no Confederacy issue right now. You're not admitting new states. There's no territorial issue over governance and things like that. There's an issue over habeas corpus, I suppose, but that's mainly reserved for people the government arbitrarily deems to be a terrorist. Those debates have been had over a century ago. Why are you still rambling about them? Why should the GOP remain the party of a dead dude as opposed to being the party of someone who is alive and capable of winning in the here and now? Who showed that he could, who had a very good presidency by generally modern standards. Again, Trump the best president since the first term of Ronald Reagan. Going back before that, you got to get into the 1950s before you get to the same level. We've only had a few brief moments of sunshine in what has been a very long, dark half-century for the United States, just to be clear. Much of what has gone on has gone wrong. Trump knew what he was doing. Certainly not perfect. I've got half a dozen different pet peeves about his presidency and some about his private life thereafter. But why not model the party after him? The fact that the Democrats call him evil, well, again, you're playing their game by saying, oh yeah, you're right, and we'll stay the party of nostalgia. That wouldn't make any sense strategically now, would it? They're trying to, what the legacy media with this, though, is signaling, is that they're afraid of MAGA. They're goddamn terrified, and not because they're worried about the Republic. They don't care. They're all rich bitches. They've got theirs. They can go to Switzerland if things get bad. They don't give a shit about that. They all have dual citizenship anyway, so they're fine. What they're worried about is him breaking the toys, them losing their monopolies and things like that, because they know he'll actually at least make an attempt to make that happen. Especially now that they've abused him so long, part of it would just be personal vengeance, retribution on his behalf. They're very steadily handing him the capability of doing that by constantly trying to persecute and lie about him, by the way. That's about all. Peace out.